what I want to do in this talk really is just to consider some of the normative assumptions that are often employed when we're discussing ideas about loss and damage. And I wanted to do that in the context, particularly for Australia, and what some of these normative assumptions mean for the kind of loss and damage obligations and duties that we have here, and also for the kind of thinking that we do about obligations to rectify climate harms per se. I think some of the assumptions that are often employed to help us think about these issues are a little bit too narrow, and that's certainly probably more than I thought it would come out in the previous sessions, where people have been pointing to all sorts of other causal factors that lead to people suffering climate harms that need reparations and so on. So really what I want to do is reflect on it on a couple of different assumptions. The first assumption is that when we look to judge a country's liability for contributing to, say, a loss and damage fund, we have to look at their contribution to climate change. Now, of course, we do have to do that, but it seems to me we have to do a lot more than that. And just looking at a country's contribution to climate change is not enough to generate the kind of accurate duties that we need to determine a loss and damage fund. Sorry, the contributions that need to go into a loss and damage fund. The second assumption that I want to think about is, even where we do consider a country's contribution to climate change as the basis for its contribution to the fund, we're looking at the wrong type of things when we think about contributions. We're looking too much at emissions and not enough at some of the other things that contribute to climate harms. And I think the significance of these claims, if they're right, really have to do with, they open up a much larger set of actions and a much larger set of agents, and put them in the set of actions and agents that we would consider when we're trying to work out who's responsible for paying their fair share of something like a loss and damage fund. Okay, so that's the goals and assumption examples along the way. So just to refresh your memory a bit, some of this has already come up in the discussions, but I'm after lunch, so I didn't know that. So in the COP28 in 2023, there was the agreement, the actualisation of the negotiations the year before to set up this loss and damage fund, which would be used to put into place a way of compensating people for the kind of climate harms with which we're all too familiar, the fires, the floods, and so on. Now, as I think someone mentioned in the last section, the loss and damage fund, as it stands currently, doesn't attempt to attribute liability, and that's because, as I'm sure you all know, the dirty fingers of the Saudis and the Russians and the Australians and everyone else has been all over it, because obviously if you did attempt to attribute liability, it would force you to confront some rather uncomfortable truths about your own country's action or lack thereof in relation to climate change. So even though the loss and damage fund as it currently exists doesn't talk about liability in the way that we might be interested in the topic, nonetheless, it doesn't stop us thinking about, so loss and damage fund doesn't consider liability, but no reason why we can't, because after all, we need to be able to think about who is really responsible and what kind of ideal that we'd like to put forward so that we can judge the kind of institutions and practices that are currently in place. So if we were thinking about how to determine whether a country had a liability to contribute to the loss and damage fund and how much they can contribute, on what basis would we deem them to have an obligation or a duty to contribute? And one very obvious and plausible answer, it seems to me, is on the basis of their contributing to creating climate harms. Okay? So in the case where a country has contributed to the creation of a climate harm, either through its current practices of emissions or some combination of its current emissions and its past emissions, we can then work out how much it has to contribute to a fund like loss and damage, and indeed to many other things. All right, and this is, as we all know, a very plausible and widely used basis for determining the liabilities for something like the loss and damage fund. Principles like the polluter pays principle, the PPP, commonly argue this and are widely deployed. As you'll know, the polluter pay principle essentially says that if an agent has engaged in action that causes pollution, then that agent should pay for the costs associated with any harm that results from that pollution. All right, so I'm just going to assume that this is a good way of working out the liability of a country. There are other ways. We could just do it on, the basis of how wealthy the country is and so on. But I'm just going to assume that this way of working that out is going to be relevant to some degree, if not the most relevant thing. Now, to think about what's problematic of doing things this way, I just want to take a step back for a moment and talk about what a climate harm is. Because in the early, say, IPCC reports, first, say, 3 reports, maybe 4 or something, when you would read those documents, or indeed if you asked your students what a climate harm is, there would be a focus on the physical dimension. So what causes the climate harm? Well, it's the fire, it's the flood, the cyclone, the drought, whatever it happens to be, okay? And that's what the IPCC refers to as the public face of climate change. And obviously you can't ignore these things. They're absolutely crucial to working out what causes the climate harm. But in its more recent reports, and see, we have the value here of the real. It's now much more perspicuous to you. The IPCC has focused on what it calls complex, maybe what I call, I'm not sure, complex causal pathways. So when you try and work out what causes a climate harm, of course what you think about is the climate hazard, the fire, the flood. But it's also what makes someone or some community vulnerable to that climate harm. That's also often just as, or even perhaps more relevant than the first condition. And it's also the degree to which someone or some community is exposed. So think about an example. When, say, a community is, or people, say, in the Philippines are washed away in a climate-induced rain event, where there's a mudslide and so on, what kills them? Well, obviously it's the flood, right? It's the flood sending bits of brick and what have you cascading through your house and killing people. But often when we explain the cause of that death, what we'll also need to consider are the reasons why they were on the mountainside in the first place. Perhaps they were so poor that they had nowhere else to live except on the most vulnerable part of the land. Perhaps they were from a community group or a racial group that was discriminated against, and they were pushed to that part of town. They couldn't live anywhere else. So when we come to say, why did that person die on the side of the hill, the explanation will refer to these 3 things, it seems to me. Not just the fact that they were, they drowned or they were hit by a bit of masonry or whatever it happens to be. You have to take into account these complex causal pathways that have resulted in them suffering this particular climate harm. Now, obviously, these kinds of vulnerability have many different guises. They can be poverty, ill health, poor infrastructure, and so on. And the IPCC now refers to these as social determinants, borrowing obviously a term from health debates, or contextual determinants. In fact, it has a dozen words it uses to refer to this in a rather annoyingly ambiguous way, and has recognised that it can't just be the climate hazard that determines what makes people subject to a climate harm. Yet, crucially, these factors are not caused by climate change, okay? So this is the crucial point here that I think contests this idea that when we look to establishing duties for liability in the loss and damage fund, we just look at a country's contribution to climate change. Because if we understand being subject to a climate harm as being a function of the climate hazard, but also things like vulnerability and exposure. And then we understand that vulnerability and exposure are themselves caused by things that have nothing very often to do with climate change, then we need a much broader understanding of the basis on which countries might be liable for contributing to loss and damage. Okay, so we can't just look to the country's contribution to climate change if we want to ideally settle this question of why they are liable. I've got an example of heat waves there. Perhaps a better example is, say, a country like East Timor. Why is a country like Timor-Leste in the position that it is now vis-a-vis climate change? Well, it's partly a matter of geography. It's where it is. That makes it subject to all sorts of variable weather events. But if we're really explaining its vulnerability, we could not ignore the fact that it was ruled by Portuguese for 350 years, and after that by the Indonesians in a way that was less than ideal for the country. And what ensued was a very devastating and bitter civil war that has left the country the 9th most vulnerable place on earth as far as climate harms go. And that's just one of many examples that we could give that would exemplify, I guess, this complex causal pathway and the need to look beyond just climate causes. The heat wave example is just a simple one. I did some reading about this. So, for instance, in Western Sydney, there are schools there with disadvantaged students in them that will be disproportionately affected by climate change because the heat waves that will impact Sydney, particularly Western Sydney, will be, well, they're more severe in the West anyway, but they'll also capture and take up people who have already existing educational disadvantages, which will make those disadvantages worse in a kind of compound way. I'm not going to talk about that much today. Okay, so what are the consequences for this, I think, what we need to adopt, which is a more expanded conception of liability for climate harm? Well, we get a larger set of agents and a larger set of actions that fall into our category of agents who might be deemed liable for contributing to something like a loss and damage fund. It expands the set to include a greater range of actions and agents, which is the main difference that this complex causal pathway accounted why it is countries or other agents are liable. I'm not going to talk about countries here. So that makes things more difficult, I think, in terms of coming up with an accurate description of why climate harm has been caused, and maybe I'll talk a bit about that if I've got time at the end. So that's the first thing that I wanted to do, was just contest this idea that when we look to establish a country's liability for contributing to the loss and damage fund, we only look at its contribution to climate change. So the second thing that I want to focus on a little more briefly, I've got slightly more time, I'm told, because of Erin can't be here, is even if we do take which we obviously should, even if we do take the country's contribution of climate harm as being significant for working out its liability for loss and damage, we're not looking at the right kind of contributions. Because very often when we talk about contributions, what we'll talk about is a country's level of domestic emissions. Okay, so you've all seen the measurements for what countries emit variously and what that might make them liable for. But it seems to me this sort of grossly underestimates their other contributions to climate harm, which are not necessarily measurable in terms of emissions. And here I'm thinking of the lobbying, the subsidising, the environmental approvals and the finance. And this is just a little table that I got from Influence Map, a very fun website. And due to my aforementioned PowerPoint skills, which we've already established, Right down the end there, that's called, what they call Australian Energy Producers. That's basically the fossil fuel lobby. And you see, this is a map of how much they've lobbied against, in fact, future made in Australia, but in general against climate measures in Australia. And you can see that right down the end there, the Australian Energy Producers have got an E+. You'll be aware, if you work at a university, it's actually quite hard to give people E+. Even your worst students, you think maybe you're a D or something. Anyway, the point here is that really, when we think about a contribution to a climate harm, when we focus on emissions, what we're essentially doing is focusing on something that is at the long end or at the end of a long causal chain. And there's many activities along that chain, such as lobbying, such as subsidies, such as finance, and so on, that are just as causally relevant and indeed probably morally relevant to what comes out of a smokestack or a tailpipe as the actual emissions. So when we say, why were those emissions produced? Is it just because they hit go on the power station, or is it because of these huge range of other activities, which I'm calling indirect contributions? And they're not picked up if we just use a country's emission profile, if you like, as a measure of its contribution to climate change. So I'm just speeding up here. And the last thing, I wanted to look as a special case of, of fossil fuel exports, because they're not counted either, of course, when we measure a country's contribution. And if you use the measure of its territorial emissions, fossil fuel exports, or the emissions that come from fossil fuel exports from countries like Australia and Canada and Norway and the USA, they don't get counted because of the measuring protocols. But it seems to me that they're a contribution nonetheless that ought to be counted. Maybe I won't go into the arguments for that in as much detail. But I just wanted to highlight these 4 countries, partly because I wrote a report about them, so I happen to know the statistics and something. But there's a huge gap. I'm sure this is known to many of you, but you can see the line there on the graphs. That's the level of domestic emissions. And then the bars represent the level of exported emissions. And this is a contribution that escapes the current measure ways in which countries' contributions are measured. And this is actually a very big number when you add it all up. So the fossil fuel exports of these 4 countries, the dirty 4, as we call them, we did originally exclude the USA and called them the dirty 3, so we could have an obscure musical reference, but also didn't get it, unfortunately. So it's the dirty 4. You can see that when the emissions are added up of all those 4 countries, they represent 11% of the world's global carbon budget, or they will do by 2030. So it's a very big number, and it's a very big thing to exclude when we're asking about a country's contribution. Okay, so that's the second point I want to make. The first point being that when we're looking at who's liable for loss and damage, we should include not just the contribution they've made to climate change, but the non-climate causal contributions they've made to the climate harm, say by making some other group vulnerable, for instance. That's the first point. The second point I wanted to make was, even where we do focus on the contributions that a country has made to climate change, we need to focus on a broad range of things, not just the emissions that they've directly produced, but the other contributions they've made as well, which might be lobbying and so on. And just as a very sort of crude way to end, I wrote a report with Oxfam a year or so ago, and we looked at one of the big things. It wasn't loss and damage, but there was the $100 billion commitment, which to global climate finance, woefully inadequate, etc. And Australia had contributed 50 million, 100 million or something to that. Other people in the room will know the exact figures, but we calculated that just putting exports in, not all the other things, that would lead to a liability for Australia of 5 billion per annum, not hundreds of millions. And I think it's that order of magnitude of difference is made when we include exports into calculations of liability for things like loss and damage as well. Anyway, I should have put the reference to that up. So just to summarise then, what I'm claiming is that we need to think more broadly about the basis on which we attribute liability for paying the costs of loss and damage when we come to think about it at a country level, and think more broadly, particularly in the area of including non-climate contributions to climate harms. And then when we do look at climate contributions, make sure that we look at a broad range of those.